Good evening, class. Our lesson for tonight is about obligations with a period. Now, Article 1193 says obligations for whose fulfillment a day certain has been fixed shall be demandable only when that day comes. Obligation with a resolutory period take effect at once but terminate upon arrival of the day certain. A day certain is understood to be that which must necessarily come, although it may not be known when. If the uncertainty consists in whether the day will come or not, the obligation is conditional and it shall be regulated by the rules of the preceding section. Now, let's talk about the meaning of an obligation with a period. So, an obligation with a period is one whose effects or consequences are subjected in one way or another to the expiration or arrival of said period or term. Now, what is the meaning of period or term? So, a period is a feature and certain event upon the arrival of which the obligation or right subject to it either arises or is terminated. Now, it is a day certain, take note, which must necessarily come. Like, for example, the year 2010 or next Christmas, although it may not be known when, like, for example, the death of a person. Now, period or term interval of time which either suspends demandability or produces extinguishment. Now, a fortuitous event does not interrupt the running of the period. You take note of that. It only relieves the contracting parties from the fulfillment of their respective obligation during the period. So, when is a period let's distinguish period and condition. So with regards to its fulfillment, a period is a certain event which must happen sooner or later at a date known beforehand or at a time which cannot be determined, while a condition is an uncertain event. With regards to time, take note that a period refers only to the future, while a condition may refer also to a past event unknown to the parties. As to influence on the obligation, a period merely fixes the time for the efficaciousness of the obligation. If suspensive, it cannot prevent the birth of the obligation in due time. If it's resolutory, it does not invalidate the fact that the obligation existed. On the other hand, a condition causes an obligation either to arise or to cease. Now, with regards to effect, when left to the debtor's will, a period which depends upon the will of the debtor empowers the court to fix the duration thereof. That's in paragraph 2 of Article 1197. While a condition which depends upon the sole will of the debtor invalidates the obligation. That's in Article 1182. And with regards to its retroactivity of effects, unless there is an agreement to the contrary, the arrival of a period does not have any retroactive effect, while the happening of the condition has retroactive effect. So, note class that like a condition, such as in Article 1183, a period must be possible. Because if a period is impossible, like for example, February 30, because you know that it will never come, no? Or like construction of a building within 24 hours, because you know it won't happen, no? It's too short. Here, the obligation is void. Okay, take note of that one. Now, let's talk about kinds of periods or terms. Number one is according to effect. We have the suspensive period and resolutory period. So, suspensive period, this is the obligation this is when the obligation begins only from a day certain upon the arrival of period. That's in paragraph 1 of Article 1193. And resolutory period is the obligation is valid up to the day certain and terminates upon arrival of the period. So, for example, in suspensive period, I will pay you 30 days from today or January 1 next year or at the end of this month. Also, with regards to resolutory period, I will give you 500 a month until the end of the year. So, meaning, every month, maghatag ka og 500 sa iya, ha, no? Ma-extinguish ang imong obligation to give the 500 inig kahuman sa tuig. Okay? So, with regards to source, we have legal period, conventional or voluntary period, and judicial period. So, legal period is when it is provided for by laws. So, gi-provide sa balaod. Conventional or voluntary period is if it is agreed by the parties. And judicial period is when it is fixed by the court. So, ang court na mismo ang nag-fix sa period. According to definiteness, we have definite period and indefinite period. Now, when it is fixed sa definite period, this is when it is fixed or it is known when it will come. An indefinite period when it is not fixed or it is not known when it will come, where the period is not fixed but a period is intended. The courts are usually empowered by law to fix the same. Article 1194. In case of loss, deterioration, or improvement of the thing before the arrival of the day certain, the rules in Article 1189 shall be observed. Take note, class, that this article speaks of loss, deterioration, or improvement of the thing before the arrival of the day certain. Now, effects of loss, deterioration, or improvement before the arrival period. So we have here condition of the thing, and the other column is effect. So with regards to loss, without fault of the debtor, the obligation is extinguished. So mo gina siya na. Kung naay fault si debtor, the obligation only of the debtor is to pay damages. With regards to deterioration, if it is without the fault of the debtor, then the impairment is borne by the creditor. Okay, wala may fault si debtor. If, however, the debtor is in fault, the creditor may choose to rescind with indemnity for damages or have it fulfilled but still with indemnity for damages. With regards to improvement, by its nature, the effect is it inures to the benefit of the creditor. No? So, kung naay improvement nga gihimo si debtor, adto gyud na mahatag nga benefit sa creditor. As at the expense of the debtor, so the debtor shall have no other right than that granted to the usufructuary. So, it is understood, class, that the thing is lost when it perishes. Or, it perishes meaning mawala gid siya, no? Or it goes out of commerce or disappears in such a way that its existence is unknown or it cannot be recovered. Now, we have here an illustration. J obliged himself to sell his yacht to Zola at half of its purchasing price on Zola's graduation, provided Zola graduates on time. So on April 25, 2016, Zola graduated on time with honors. However, the day before his graduation, Typhoon Haiyan destroyed the yacht. So since the loss happened before the day certain and the loss was due to a fortuitous event, the obligation of J to sell his yacht to Zola is extinguished. So unsa pa may iyang ibaligya nga yate nga nawala or na destroy naman ang yacht because of a fortuitous event. Okay? So, let's proceed to Article 1195. Anything paid or delivered before the arrival of the period, the obligor being unaware of the period or believing that the obligation has become due and demandable may be recovered with the fruits and interests. Example, D owes C 10,000, which was supposed to be paid on December 31 this year. By mistake, D paid his obligation on December 31 last year. Assuming that today is June 30, D can recover the 10% plus 600, which is the interest for 1/2 year at the legal rate of 12%, or a total of 10,600. But D cannot recover, except the interest, if the debt had already matured. Neither can there be a right to recovery if D had knowledge of the period. The theory of solutio indebiti will not apply. D is deemed to have impliedly renounced the period. There is no recovery in personal obligations. Article 1195 has no application to obligations to do or not to do because, as to the former, it is physically impossible to recover the service rendered, and as to the latter, as the obligor performs not by doing, so he cannot, of course, recover what he has not done. You take note of that concept, class. Article 1196. Whenever in an obligation a period is designated, it is presumed to have been established for the benefit of both the creditor and the debtor, unless from the tenor of the same or other circumstances it should appear that the period has been established in favor of one or of the other. The presumption here, class, is for the benefit of both parties. Okay, so let's talk about the benefit of a period, no? Anong na ay significance ang period. A is obligor cannot be compelled to pay or perform before the arrival of the period. What does it mean? So si obligor, class, dili nimo siya pwede pugson, no? If naagani mo gisabutan nga period kanus aka mo bayad or kanus ani mo i-render ang service, dili nimo siya pwede pugson before moabot ang period nga inyong kasabutan. Also, the obligee cannot compel payment or performance. Dili pwede mamugos si obligee nga pabayron si obligor, no? Or pabuhaton sa service nga gikasabutan before the arrival of the period. Both are subjects to the right of each party to waive, even if the obligor is willing to pay interest for the remainder of the period. Now, in an obligation subject to a period fixed by the parties, take note, class, that the period is presumed to have been established for the benefit of both the creditor and the debtor. Kinagsabot gud sila sa period. This means that before the expiration of the period, the debtor may not fulfill the obligation, and neither may the creditor demand its fulfillment without the consent of the other, especially if the latter would be prejudicial or inconvenience thereby. Kay, again, sila ang nagsabot sa period. Okay. We have the case of Abisamis versus Woodcraft Works Incorporated. So, moning hitabo sa kaso, class. This was a contract in the delivery. There was a contract in the delivery of logs before the end of July 1951, but not earlier than April of the same year, as an option depending on availability of logs and vessels between Woodcraft Works and Abisamis Shipping. The failure of the appellant to send vessels to Dolores Samar was because of the storm that swept away all the logs on May 5, 1951. Under the contract, the delivery period of date was accomplished and that have been agreed to avoid the storm. Woodcraft Works sued Abisamis to bear all the loss as a result of the typhoon. So the issue of this case is whether or not Abisamis is liable to pay the loss. The Supreme Court held as a consequence of typhoon that struck on May 5, there was yet no delay on the part of the Abisamis. The obligation between parties are the reciprocal one, no? The appellant to purchase the vessel and the appellee to purchase the log. It was also the obligation to benefit both parties. The period was agreed upon are decided to actually avoid typhoons. The corresponding loss must be shouldered by the appellee. Now, the tenor of the obligation or the circumstances may, however, show that it was the intention of the parties to constitute the period for the benefit of either the debtor or the creditor. The benefit of the period may be the subject to express stipulation of the parties. However, there are exceptions to the general rule, class. 1. Term is for the benefit of the debtor alone. So here, he cannot be compelled to pay prematurely, but he can if he desires to do so. So, pwede si creditor, debtor mo bayad if he desires to do so, pero dili nimo siya pwede mapugos pagpabayad. So, example, D borrowed from C 10,000 to be paid within 1 year without interest. So, in this case, the period of 1 year should be deemed intended for the benefit of D only. Therefore, he can pay anytime, but he cannot be compelled to pay before 1 year. Second example, D promised to pay his debt on or before December 31, 2019. Here, the payment is to be made within a stipulated period, but D can pay before said date. Kung iyahang gusto, pili nimo siya pwede pugson. Sa term naman nga benefited ang creditor, he may demand fulfillment even before the arrival of the term, but the debtor cannot require him to accept payment before the expiration of the stipulated period. So, unsang example ani, D borrowed from C 10,000 payable on December 31 with the stipulation that D cannot make the payment before the lapse of the period, but C demand fulfillment even before said date. Here, C can demand payment at any time, but D cannot shorten the 1 year period without the consent of C. Ordinarily, there must be stipulation granting the benefit of the term to only the creditor. So, unsaon pag-compute ang term or period? Now, the Administrative Code of 1987, however, provides that when we talk of legal periods, this is year. Kung year, it shall be understood to be 12 calendar months. If month, it is 30 days, unless it refers to a specific calendar month, in which case it shall be computed according to the number of days the specific month contains. When we talk of day, this is 24 hours, and night from sunset to sunrise. A calendar month is a month designated in a calendar without regard to the number of days it may contain. It is the period of time running from the beginning of a certain number day up to, but not it there is not sufficient number of days in the next month, then up to and including the last day of that month. Note class that under the administrative code, a year is composed of 12 calendar months, the number of days being irrelevant. Article 1197. If the obligation does not fix a period, but from its nature and the circumstances it can be inferred that a period was intended, the courts may fix the duration thereof. The court shall also fix the duration of the period when it depends upon the will of the debtor. In every case, the court shall determine such period as may, under the circumstances, have been probably contemplated by the parties. Once fixed by the courts, the period cannot be changed by them. So, generally, class, court is without power to fix a period. The period mentioned in Article 1197 refers to a judicial period as distinguished from a period fixed by the parties in their contract, which is known as a contractual period. If the obligation does not state a period and no period is intended, the court is not authorized to fix a period. The courts have no right to make contracts for the parties. You take note of that. Let's have an example. D obliged himself to pay C 10,000. Since the obligation does not fix a period, not even the court may fix a period. The reason is because the contract is the law between the parties and its terms cannot be changed by the court. So, when courts may fix period? General rule, courts may fix the period of an obligation when, number one, the obligation does not fix a period, but from its nature and the circumstances, it can be inferred that a period was intended. Second, the obligation depends upon the will of the debtor. Exceptions is if the court determines that one of the three circumstances are present, it must decide the period, which is probably contemplated by the parties. Number one, obligation does not fix a period, but from its nature and circumstances, it can be inferred that a period was intended. Second, the period is void, such as when it depends upon the will of the debtor. Third, if the debtor binds himself when his means permit him to do so. You take note of this circumstances class. So, period fix cannot be changed by the courts. If the parties agreed for a period, even the court cannot change that. Period agreed upon by the parties. If there is a period again, if there is a period agreed upon and it is already lapsed, the court cannot fix another period. Period fixed by the court. So from the moment the parties give their acceptance and consent to the period fixed by the court. So naay fix ang court na period and then the parties agreed, accept and consented it, said period acquires the nature of a contract because the effect of such acceptance and consent by the parties is exactly the same as if they had expressly agreed upon it, and having been agreed upon by them, it becomes the law governing their contract. However, the parties may modify the term by, of course, a new agreement. Article 1198. The debtor shall lose every right to make use of the period when, after the obligation has been contracted, he becomes insolvent unless he gives a guarantee or security for the debt. Second, when he does not furnish to the creditor the guarantees or securities which he has promised. Third, when by his own acts he has impaired said guarantees or securities after their establishment, and when through a fortuitous event they disappear unless he immediately gives new ones equally satisfactory. Fourth, when the debtor violates any undertaking in consideration of which the creditor agreed to the period, and when the debtor attempts to abscond. Debtor obligor may lose the benefit of the period, so therefore he may be compelled to pay immediately. So in the following cases, naigibutang na ko din na class FAT visa. Debtor becomes insolvent. So when his assets are less than his liabilities, mao na ma-insolvent siya. Exception is when he gives security to the obligation. Second is failure to create or establish the security promise. Third, when security established but is later impaired through the fault of the debtor or totally lost due to the fault of the debtor or probably fortuitous event, unless debtor provides another security of equal value. Next, violation of any undertaking on the basis of which period is granted. Next, debtor attempts to abscond. So, take note class, mere attempt is sufficient because if actual abscondment is to be awaited, then creditor can no longer collect. And when an acceleration clause stipulation. This applies to obligations payable in installment or based on amortization schedule where stipulation says that failure to pay one or some installments or amortizations will entitle creditor to accelerate payment, such as to call for the payment of the entire remaining unpaid obligation. Example for when debtor becomes insolvent. For example, DOC 10,000 due and payable on December. So if D becomes insolvent, say on September 10, C can demand immediate payment from D even before the maturity unless gives sufficient guarantee or security. The insolvency in this case need not be judicially declared. It is sufficient that the assets of D are less than his liabilities or D is unable to pay his debt as they mature. Note that the insolvency of D must occur after the obligation has been contracted. Okay? So, when debtor failed to create security or guarantee, example, suppose in the same example, D promised to mortgage his house to secure the debt. If he fails to furnish said security as promised, he shall lose his right to the period. Third is when guarantees have been impaired or have disappeared. So, if the debt is secured by a mortgage on the house of D, but the house was burned through his fault, the obligation also become demandable unless D gives a new security equally satisfactory. So, in the case of when the debtor violates the undertaking, suppose C agreed to the period in consideration of the promise of D to repair a piano of C. The violation of this undertaking by D gives C the right to demand immediate payment of the loan. And when the debtor attempts to abscond, so like mulaya siya, no? Before the due date of the obligation, D changes address without informing C and the intention of escaping from his obligation. This act of D is a sign of bad faith which results in the loss of his right to the benefit of the period stipulated. Observe class ha that a mere attempt or intent to abscond is sufficient. Kay kung imo pa nang paabuton nga mulayas, nanisamot nga dili nakaka-collect. Okay, so that was obligation with a period. Next meeting, we will discuss alternative or facultative obligations. Thank you.